I want to talk for a minute about the idea of being a cultural Christian and whether or not I am a cultural Christian. Because when I make videos talking about staying a Christian, a lot of people use the word cultural Christian to refer to like where I am now and what I believe now. So, on the one hand, I know there's a certain discourse about this. I've heard it from people like Richard Dawkins that they would say I sort of identify culturally as a Christian. But I don't necessarily believe the metaphysical stuff or something like that. And I want to push back on that in this video. Now, there are like elements of the way that cultural Christianity is used that I don't like. In some ways, like I hear it, for example, from Europeans, and it seems to be sort of like a dog whistle for like we're a Christian culture at base. So it's like actually turns into like an anti-Islamic thing or something. But I'm not going to talk about that in this video because this is what I actually do want to talk about. Okay, I want you to stop and think about this and listen very carefully as I say this. I am a cultural Christian, but so is everybody else, or at least everybody else who claims to be Christian or comes from a Christian culture. And I think what happens is that it's easy to set up this dichotomy in your head of like people who just go through the motions or people who really believe it or something like that. The irony is that every single form of Christianity I have ever encountered has been cultural Christianity. Like when I was an evangelical, when I was a fundamentalist and I thought the Bible is the word of God and I can build my life on it and I listened to Christian music and like CCM and like we read all the same stuff, like people who grew up evangelical in the 90s, like we all know the same cultural reference points because that was a culture. But it's not even just about the stuff we consumed or read or listened to or whatever. It's also about the way that we were socialized to think about salvation, for example, as being like this moment where you pray, and we would talk about the ABCs of salvation. We would talk about asking Jesus into your heart. That is a culturally mediated way to think about salvation. In fact, there is nothing in any form of Christianity today that you can experience that is not cultural Christianity. Every Christianity is cultural Christianity. And I think a lot of people would try to say, oh, the distinction is like there's a metaphysical distinction that like I may be like just like I might be a cultural Christian, but maybe you're a Christian who actually like believes stuff. But like even belief is culturally conditioned. The way that you think about the Trinity, for example, if you're like, I have to think the right things in my head, and those things in my head have some kind of Oop, if you're hit the mic. If you're like, I'm going to think the right things in my head, and those things in my head have some kind of like metaphysical reflection out there, and like that's what it means to be a Christian, culturally conditioned. Like these are ways of thinking that you have been socialized to think. And that's the one reason I think why the Trinity can actually make sense to Christians, because we just grew up thinking about it and accepting it. And it's weird to people who don't come from our culture because it's a cultural belief. And I think you would be hard pressed to find anything that isn't cultural Christianity. And no matter what your own like Christian identity is, but if you come from like me, like a broadly like Western Christian identity, if you speak in tongues, it's because your culture has conditioned you to do that and to expect that. That's glossolalia. It doesn't only happen in evangelicalism. It happens in actually other religions. You can find it in other parts of the world, but it's always people who have been culturally conditioned, I guess, like we could say sociologically conditioned to speak in tongues. My Pentecostal friends could all slip into tongues fairly easily. It's culture. If you're driving down the road and you think that God gave you a parking spot, that's culture. If you are going to go up at an altar call and think that you've experienced something of the divine, that's culture. And like, sure, there are ways that like interacts with your psychology. You could argue that there are ways that it like reflects the metaphysical if you want. I'm not even going to go there in this video, but if you want to argue that like there's real metaphysical and spiritual realities, fine, you can make that argument. But the only access you have to any of those things is through culture. The only way you have to think about, experience, or live religion comes through a culture that has conditioned you to think about that. And that's why I find the idea of a cultural Christian really, really annoying, because people use it to set up this dichotomy between like believers and non-believers, or people who are real Christians and people who aren't Christians, or people like sometimes atheists will use it more positively to say like, oh, well, it's just people who like this stuff but don't believe this stuff. But like, it's all the same thing. It's all culture. Every way that we engage with Christianity is cultural Christianity. And I think you could even argue, and here's where I'm really going to piss people off, I think you could even argue that atheism is cultural Christianity because it's a specific cultural response. Primarily, I know it's not just non-Christians or former Christians or whatever who are atheists, but it is a cultural response to Christianity that came like primarily out of Christianity. So to argue that cultural Christianity makes any sense as some sort of category of human behavior or some sort of category of religious behavior or whatever actually makes no sense. And I'm not going to cede the ground to people who believe that they have true Christianity and my Christianity is just cultural, because their Christianity is cultural too. And the thing that I talk about a lot on this channel, when I talk about like where the Bible came from, where the canon came from, where our beliefs came from, how they emerged, like as a historian, I can study these things and I can see that each and everything that you take for granted, even if you see yourself as a true Christian, is all formulated in culture. There's no way to get out of the culture that formed you, that formed us. Now, that's okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you're going to keep using the word cultural Christian to describe either yourself or anybody else, you need to recognize it actually means nothing. We are all cultural Christians, but the way that you engage with your faith, no matter who you are, if you are any kind of a Christian, you are a cultural Christian. Evangelicals are cultural Christians. Catholics are cultural Christians. And that's why, by the way, I don't like, my wife is Catholic, and when we go to a Catholic church, she just sinks into it. It makes total sense to her. It's real and meaningful to her in a way, but it's because it's culture. It's the way that she's being socialized to engage with religion in a way that I never was. All there is cultural Christianity. So can we please stop pretending this label means anything?